This video will be about complex numbers. So far, we've talked about solving quadratic equations, and when we took square roots, we had a problem sometimes. There'd be occasions when we would have something like this, the square root of negative 25. Okay, and we said we can't solve that because we know that negative 5 times negative 5 equals positive 25, and 5 times 5 equals positive 25. Okay, so we can never make negative 25. However, we have something called a complex number. Okay, sometimes we call them imaginary numbers. Okay, so I'll make that up here. So complex numbers, also called imaginary numbers. And that will make sense here because we call the imaginary number I. Okay, now I is equal to the square root of negative 1. Okay, so you'll never see I as a variable, but when we see I, it means it equals square root of negative 1. So we're going to go ahead and see what that looks like with exponents and then simplify some. Okay, so we have I to the 0, I to the first, I squared, and I to the third. So I to the 0, we should know what that is. That's going to be 1, because anything to the 0 power is always 1. I to the first equals I. Okay? Nothing too fancy there. Now, I squared is when it starts to get interesting. So I squared is I times I, or the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, which equals negative 1. So what that means is that if ever we see an I squared, we can rewrite that as negative 1, and we'll be expected to rewrite that as negative 1 as well. Okay? Now, I cubed is the same as I times I squared. You know, I is I, and I squared is negative 1, so I times negative 1 equals negative I. Okay, so when I to the 0 equals 1, I to the first equals I squared is negative 1, I cubed is negative I. Okay, so we're really simplifying some of these. Okay, so let's talk about square root of negative 25. That's the same as saying the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. And so we know what both of these are. We know that square root of negative 1 is I. We know that square root of 25 is 5. So this will equal 5I. Okay, let's try a couple more. So let's say that we have the square root of negative 9. That's the same as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9. That's I. Square root of 9 is 3. That equals 3I. Now you may be thinking, why is it not plus or minus 3? That's because we don't have a variable. Okay, it's only plus or minus with square roots if we have a variable. Now say look at the square root of negative 17. So that's going to equal, so break everything else down, square root of negative 1 times square root of 17. We know that square root of negative 1 is I. We don't know what the square root of 17 is, so we'll just keep it as square root of 17, and that's going to equal I square root 17. Now, we see how this is 3I, this is I square root 17. It does not matter which one comes first. The reason why I put the I in front of my square root is because sometimes the I might end up under the square root, which it should not. Okay? If it's in front of the square root, we won't have any confusion. You got a few questions to answer about complex numbers, and when you simplify those, go ahead and answer those now.